with our guest speakers, I just have a few things to note. Before we get started, I just wanted to thank our sponsors. Without their generous support, we would not be able to offer these webinars free of charge. So we thank them very much for allowing us to bring this education and this knowledge transfer to you for free. We'd also like to respectfully acknowledge that we are hosting this webinar on traditional territory of the following nations. So the BC Wildlife Federation is located in Surrey, and everybody that is working within the Wetlands Education Program team lives in the Lower Mainland. So that's the traditional territory of the Coast Salish peoples, including the Katzie, Coquitlam, Kwantlen, Kikite, Tsawwassen, Stolo, and Musqueam First Nations. And this is totally different than what we usually have as the Wetlands Institute. So this year, thanks to COVID-19, we've had to turn everything on its head a little and participate in these knowledge exchanges virtually. But usually, and I just want to give a shout out to what the Wetland Institute usually is, just because in future years, we hope that we can integrate this back into how we run the workshop. So it is an intensive 7-day hands-on workshop that educates participants about wetland stewardship, restoration, construction, enhancement, and education. It's very much in the field learning, and we practice up-to-date field techniques with experts or professionals in their field. And usually we have the participants practice or gain practical experience in restoring or enhancing at least one wetland. So we usually have at least one wetland project that we're able to visit during the Wetland Institute, and participants have the ability to participate hands-on in that restoration. There is limited seats for this workshop. Participants apply to attend, unlike all of our other workshops where people just register and sign up. Next year, we're hoping to integrate a hybridized model between virtual and in-person outside learning. So there will be very limited seats, less than normal, to allow social distancing and proper procedures to keep everybody safe. Participants who apply should have a wetland related project that they are currently working on, whether that be restoration, protection, enhancement, or an educational project. This workshop has over $1,000 value, but it is free to BC residences. Thanks to our generous sponsors and our ability to receive grants for this workshop. And every single participant that comes through the Wetland Institute does receive up to 3 years of support post-workshop on their project with experts, as well as Neil Fletcher, who is the manager of the Wetlands Education Program. So just before we get started, I just want to give you a short overview. For all technical questions regarding Zoom, please use the chat icon. For any questions that you have for the guest speakers, please use the Q&A icon. So as you might have noticed, you are muted and your video is not on. So through these chat icons, through the chat and the Q&A is how you're going to be able to communicate with us. Without further ado, I'd like to just introduce our guest speakers. So first thing, we have Heather Larratt joining us from 9:30 to 10 a.m. She's with Larratt Aquatic Consulting. She has over 40 years of experience with water quality, environmental reclamation, mine reclamation, wetland development, bacterial remediation of mined wastewater, reservoir management, phytoplankton and periphyton taxonomy, and project design. And she is going to be speaking to us about wetlands and how they can be used as bioreactors to help mitigate water quality. And then after Heather, Denise Clark will be joining us from 10 to 11, and she is a fish and fish habitat biologist with the Department of Fisheries and Oceans Canada. She completed her Master's of Science at Thompson Rivers University under Dr. Brian Heise, focusing on macroinvertebrates, and then she was also a limnology lab instructor at TRU, and she will be talking to us about macroinvertebrates in wetlands and how they can help you determine if you have a pollution problem in your wetland. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and then without further ado, I'd like to welcome Heather.
Thank you very much. Just going to make sure that the screen is shared adequately.
Yes, I can see it.
Perfect. Okay, thank you very much, all of you, for attending. I realize in some respects this presentation is kind of like singing to the choir, but I do hope to inspire you with what is possible in a wetland, because there's a huge array of bacteria hosted by wetlands, and that's not the really exciting things that we see on top of the water. But if we settled a competition between bacteria and humans, the smart money would be on bacteria. I want to start by giving you an overview of why wetlands are so important in terms of economics. I feel like this is an area where we really rely on intrinsic value, and it doesn't make sense to decisions that are made based on economics. What you see before you is an assessment that was done by UBC Okanagan, and it was looking at the values of ecosystem services, and they concluded that in the Okanagan, ecosystem services accounted for $6.7 billion per year. So that is accounting for what would it cost to provide equivalent services in an engineered scenario. I've highlighted the wetlands here because it was the single most valuable land cover contributing to this overall ecosystem services. And I put a sidebar over here on the right that it shows that for this example, just conserving floodplain wetland saved $27 million per year plus $100 million in development cost. So I don't agree with the idea that wetlands are not of extreme economic value. It's been said that wetlands are the kidneys of the earth, i.e. they do a ton of filtration. So I'm going to dive for a second into what wetlands do in terms of nutrient removal. Nitrogen is quite easy to remove, but note that you need to have a sizable amount of wetland. Phosphorus, sulfur also removed. Metals are removed, and this is quite important, and that's because in a wetland we have coupled aerobic and anaerobic removals. Sulfate-reducing bacteria are actually near and dear to my heart. They produce hydrogen sulfide, which reacts with a whole suite of metals and creates precipitates that are quite resistant. Organic absorption is also important in wetlands. Iron cycling, there's lots going on there. Biodegradation is also very possible, especially for the polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, or PAHs, and some other chemicals as well. They remediate bacteria, and those can be pathogenic. They sequester carbon, both as organic material and as carbonates. They also buffer storm flows, which calms the hydrodynamics, allows sediment to settle, and protects against the increasing frequency of extreme weather events that we're now experiencing. And of course, provides habitat for just about everything. There's 4 ways to a wetland. Conserve, which is the best and first choice. And this, I would argue, includes not directing stormwater to it in the urban landscape. That is an impact in and of itself. It may be a valid use of that wetland, but it's not equivalent to conserving it. Restoring is putting the original flows back and waiting for a while, or considering reconstructing it. Repurposing is finding an existing water-filled hole, in my language, and construct is make your own hole. We're all used to seeing, and this is a pre-existing hole that's been reclaimed as a wetland. We're all used to seeing the surface of what a wetland looks like. But an awful lot of what's important goes on under the water surface, mediated by macrophytes, periphyton, that's the slime algae that grows on rocks, and most particularly the bacteria. The black you see there is being generated by sulfate-reducing bacteria. For those of you that know and love chemistry, this is your slide. For those of you that hate it, bear with me, it's really important, and this is the only one. After this, we get to more fun things, well, in my view anyway. what this diagram is showing you the engine of a wetland. After the hydraulics of water flow, this is where the work happens. Please note that the scale is in millimeters. So what we have is a water cover, and oxygen, this line on the diagonal here, is supplied by eddy diffusion in that surface water layer. When you get to the diffusive boundary layer separating the sediment from the water layer, you're reduced to molecular diffusion, or just the jostling of molecules to send oxygen down. Oxygen starts to decline precipitously. The organic layer that sits on top is oxic. That means aerobic bacterial decomposition can proceed. It is orders of magnitude faster than anaerobic decomposition. Once we get into the suboxic, it becomes possible for denitrification, and it becomes possible for conversions of manganese and iron. These have significance in terms of other reactions that are mediated, and they signal where you're at in terms of your oxygen concentration. Moving below that, you get to the anoxic organic layer, and here is where you get the sulfate-reducing bacteria and fins moving sulfate to hydrogen sulfide. The hydrogen sulfide then responds and reacts to a whole suite of metals, including most of the transition metals, producing a black precipitate, which is very resistant to decomposition. It's more or less permanent if you keep it underwater. And finally, at the bottom, this particular diagram was done for tailings at a mine site. You get the breakdown of organic material to methane. And the smell that you all love from wetlands is a combination of hydrogen sulfide and methane, better known as swamp gas. So this is what happens if you don't conserve wetlands. If we go back into the good old days, a great place to put a reservoir was on top of a wetland, because you already knew that that region saved or conserved water, it stored water. So what happened here was there were wetlands, if you look at the bathymetric map here, in the very dark blue in front of the dam and in the two side bays. Then they dammed it and put a reservoir on top, which is a drinking water supply. It's not a bad idea, but it's not a great idea, because this reservoir is overproductive. It's still receiving nutrients from those former wetland sediments, and that fuels algae blooms. And the sediment cores still show intact cattail leaves some 60 years later. I mean, it doesn't look like sushi, I'll admit, but it's quite amazing how slow anaerobic decomposition can be. But those sediments are still exerting an effect on this reservoir. So should the reservoir have been built? That's a difficult question, but we have sacrificed a wetland and we pay for that. The next concept is to restore a pre-existing wetland. In this case, this wetland was removed to create material for an adjacent golf course construction. When we went to put the water back, because this area had previously been disturbed, and you could see a bunch of trials here, those little rectangles at the back, where we're trying various weed control methods, you learn to fear the power of an invasive weed seed. This had been disturbed and left untouched for 20 years or more. And once we put machines in here, we have an invasive weed problem, which has been very, very difficult to resolve. We've used barrier methods. We've ended up resorting to chemicals. Obviously, you can't use them within 10 meters of the water. None of that has provided us a solution, particularly against Canada thistle. So repurposing. This is work I absolutely love doing. What you're looking at is a tailings pond. That's a pond that has been used to store the residual ground up rock from mining. And they, very fortunately for us, had to lower the water level briefly to do some dam maintenance. We took advantage of that to plant on 2000 some rather pathetic looking cattail root masses. We knew that the substrate would stay anaerobic, which is what cattails require. So fast forward 8 years, and those pathetic looking patches of cattail that the students said, this is never going to work, that helped us with the planting, has generated this massive cattail that you see on the right. We also transplant sedges from sites on the mine site, I might add, 2 sites on the mine site. We're not going in and trouncing existing intact wetlands. What we did was we discovered that 30 by 30 centimeter plugs of sedge were a good way to move. And you see where we were just putting them out here. And 5 years later, you see these sort of tent-shaped patches that have grown in from those original masses, and they're still expanding today. Tailings, by the way, has a lot of nitrogen, a ton of nitrogen, and virtually no phosphorus. So hopefully this will inspire you that if we can get it to happen here, you can get it to happen in a better substrate than what we were using. This has to be our favorite way to plant of all, and that is go collect cattail seed heads after they've had a frost in the fall, which is a good way to get absolutely covered in cattail seed, by the way. You could probably plant your clothing in. That would be a new way to generate cattails. But all we did was we took grocery bags of seed heads and stomped them into the cracks in the mud, and then came back in the spring after it had reflooded. And you see after 1 year what the stands looked like, and after 4 years. So very easy. If they don't all grow, it's okay. We also need to build resilience. You don't want a monoculture of just one plant. So we also introduced bulrush from another site on the mine, or it had volunteered. And you can see that we've got to get a good diversity of plants going here. There's a significant amount of root underneath the bulrush and underneath the cattail. These roots are really very important because they'll actually move some oxygen down into what is an anaerobic substrate. So along every single root hair, you have an oxic-anoxic boundary. It's basically replicating a water treatment plant in terms of the bacteria that they host. So 2005 again, and 2012. So a few short years later, and this thing looks even better now. You can see these funny little patches of willow that have started just back of the shoreline. Those are now respectable clumps of willow. This is just to inspire you that we didn't spend a lot of money planting this up. If you have the luxury of the time to wait, you can get some pretty important results. This is a tailings pond reclaimed as a wetland, featuring waterfowl use. That was what our goal was. In that turquoise box at the back, though, if you really squint closely at your screen, you might be able to see some little white dots. Those are trumpeter swans. I was so excited that they had finally decided to join us on their migration. And later that year, I learned that a cull was being contemplated. I'm like, oh, really? Long story short of this wetland, it is now hosting over half of all the bird species that are ever encountered in British Columbia. It has become an important stopping area for migratory birds, and we have every intention of protecting this so that we haven't invited them to come and then we're going to take it away from them. We're confident that they're safe here. Everything you can imagine has been sampled and will be sampled in perpetuity. We sampled the substrates, the plants, the water, everything the birds are going to interact with, and we keep close tabs on it. If you have to make your own hole, you're going to have to be patient. This is because it takes about 100 years to get to full equivalence with an existing wetland. I do not advocate the safety that you see being offered in this photograph. These happen to be BCIT students. Basically, constructed treatment wetlands come in 2 flavors: surface flow on the top, subsurface flow on the bottom. Surface flow has the advantage of better flow capacity, and the disadvantage is if you're trying to treat the water, it has the opportunity to short circuit most of your treatment, shoot across the surface and out to your outlet. It does, however, have open water habitat opportunities. My personal favorite is the subsurface wetland style, where you're going to distribute the flow through the rhizosphere, through the area that's rooted, where it's hosting all those lovely bacteria and microbes, and then it's going to be discharged. The problem here is you have much lower flow capacity, and you need to bear in mind that you're going to need to have an overflow or some form of bypass. This type of wetland has seasonal wet habitat opportunities. If you're designing a wetland to solve a particular problem, know your problem ahead of time. In this case, as you can see, if you focus on the bar graph, these are 4 lakes in the same region. All of them have human impact. Most of them have salt in the low teens, which is kind of unfortunately normal. And then you have Logan Lake, which is kind of off the charts. And I know that there's a highway going past Logan Lake, but I said, you know, I really can't believe that that highway and the salt applied to that highway is really jacking us up into the 200s for sodium and chloride. You see this graph for sodium. And the people that were local that were working on this restoration project said, oh, maybe it's a salt shed site. And I looked at them, I said, what salt shed site? Well, it turns out that there had been a MOTI, Ministry of Transportation, salt shed site here. They'd put a liner down, but the liner wasn't successful in preventing the salination of the surface water and, most unfortunately, the subsurface drainage that travels all through the area you see with all the arrows here. This is the area where we're constructing wetlands to try to intercept that salt. Salt's really tough to get rid of, by the way, particularly chloride. It's very unreactive, so it's not doing a lot of damage, but it's also difficult to remove. When we looked at the sediments, like initially MOTI said, well, you know, it's okay. We'll take the salt shed site away. And they did. And we said, we're going to have to come back and remediate. And then we're going to have to wait a long time. So if you look at the Logan Lake natural pond sediments for chloride, this is sediment sampling now, it's 10, the wetlands 1500. Drop down to sodium, 281 versus 1400. Obviously, the whole area, including the lake, shows salinized substrates. Just an interesting caveat, the other lakes that are in the area have cyanobacteria blooms. Logan Lake does not. And I've warned them that if we solve the salt problem, we may then have to address the phosphorus issue. So I want to give you some more tips. And this is on staking. If you've never done it, it's lots of fun. Your stakes need to be approximately the thickness of your thumb. If they're longer or taller or thicker than that, you might want to paint the tops with just plain latex paint. If you're lucky, and be prepared to only have about 10 or 20% survival long-term, you end up with what you see on the right and the bottom here. You can also use logs. This works for willow very well. Cottonwood less well. Red osier dogwood, theoretically, I've never had a lot of success. Or you can stomp in just wattling, just stomp in branches. And if you're fortunate and it's nice and wet and gooey substrate, you're going to win. I can't stress this long enough. In terms of building an economic case or a case at all for doing wetland reconstruction, restoration, conservation, first of all, you need to have long-term data collection. So even if you're given a grant, see if you can't spend money over several years instead of spending all your money in 1 year. What we really need is regular sampling. Even if it can only happen every couple of years, please give consideration to long-term data sets. That's really where the solution is, especially with a moving climate. Photo points are obvious and excellent. And frankly, a photo is probably worth 1,000 words in a report, probably more. So you're taking photographs at the exactly same position year over year. The rest of these are provided for ideas for you. Please consider data sharing. This is where the power is at. It's gaining traction in municipalities throughout the province. And compare your results to results obtained elsewhere. This is an excellent resource that's available through Okanagan Basin Water Board. I recognize this is put out by Associated Engineering for constructing wetlands for stormwater management in particular. but it's got some great ideas and overall concepts. It's a well thought out document. I strongly think it's worth a read. So to conclude now, why wetlands? We need the water treatment. We need the habitat. It's in sharp decline because in the past it wasn't recognized. In the Okanagan, we now stand at less than 20% of the wetlands that we started with 100 years ago. And we need the hydrologic calming. It's worth money. If we have to build things to replace those services, it's expensive. Why now? We need the resilience to buffer extreme events that are coming at us more frequently. And we simply can't afford not to. And how? I would argue that conservation is first, restoration is second, repurposing is third, and constructing from scratch is your final option. All four of them are good, but I would say they're in order of value. And with that, I will turn it back to the hosts and entertain questions or thoughts or ideas.
Great. Thank you so much, Heather. That was super informative. We do have one question here in the Q&A. So Kyle asks, if there's a high amount of chlorides present, are you able to add a great deal of activated charcoal, or would that present its own issue?
No, activated charcoal is a fabulous resource. It happens to be very expensive. So you're going to use that with care and caution. What it does for you is activated charcoal has an absolutely massive surface area for bacteria. It also provides some carbon, which is why it's used in water treatment. It's an excellent resource. I use it in constructed bioreactors where I can control where it is and what it receives. So you might consider using it as a polishing step after the water's been through your pond. But that's a very good question and a good thought. Chloride will respond to activated charcoal.
So does anybody have any more questions for Heather before we get going? Great. Okay, so Miranda asks, do you have any recommendations for stormwater treatment of nitrogen?
Yes. There, if it's possible, you will want to use the subsurface drainage style. That's where you're going to get the nitrification, denitrification. That's where you're going to get the nitrogen blowing off as a gas, either as ammonia, as nitrous oxide, believe it or not, or as N2 gas. So the only issue is in order to remove a significant amount of nitrogen, it needs to be a decent sized wetland. A little tiny puddle is not going to give you the treatment that you want. Not if you're trying to deal with a sizable flow of stormwater. The issue with stormwater, unfortunately, is it all comes out at you at once. And so the key there is to have storage. You need a big pond to store that storm flow to be of maximum benefit, but some benefit is still some benefit.
Great, thanks, Heather. We have two more questions. So Carolyn asks, can you touch on if and how cattails take up heavy metals?
I would argue that what the cattails are doing is providing a host environment for sulfate reducing bacteria, and it's the sulfate reducing bacteria that are doing the heavy lifting. How they do that is by hydrogen sulfide reacting with the metals. We're actually not 100% sure for all metals if it's actually the target metal sulfide, or if it is an iron sulfide target metal composite. And to some extent, we actually don't care as long as those metals are permanently precipitated. And as I mentioned before, they're very resistant to being broken down. Metal sulfides are, but they have to stay water covered. That's the key. If you expose it to the air and to oxidation, then you're slowly going to undo the work that you've done. So just bear that in mind.
All right, we have time for just one more question. So Elodie asked, for contaminated study in a wetland, what is the frequency of water sampling and soil sampling?
Okay, good question. I would say that you're going to start off doing intensive sampling, look at your data and ramp it back from there. If you possibly can, I would suggest monthly through the growing season to start for water. And for the sediments, you can go, I think you can probably go annual, but bear in mind when you're doing sediment sampling, you need to do composites. Sediment is much more variable spatially than water is. So you want to do a number of locations in that site and composite those samples and look at it that way. If you have the luxury in sediment sampling, I would recommend coring over grabs so that you can see your layers. But I recognize that a big chunk of budget ends up going to that. And so it's basically what you can afford. And please consider whether you can get funding to maintain that sampling year over year, because that's where you're going to get it. Sediment sampling, once we're established, I do it once every 2, 3, or 5 years, depending on the project. Water sampling every year, hopefully multiple times through the growing season.